The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as it sank lower toward the horizon. The air was calm, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from nearby lawns. In a quiet suburban neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, life moved at its usual pace. Dogs barked lazily in backyards, children played on sidewalks before being called inside for dinner, and cars drifted by like whispers on the road. It was the kind of evening that made people feel safe, secure, and grateful for the simple pleasures of life. Harold Grayson sat in his favorite armchair by the window, sipping a cup of tea while flipping through an old book he'd read countless times before. Now retired, Harold spent most of his days tending to his garden or indulging in hobbies he never had time for during his decades-long career as the director of the FBI. His tenure had been marked by high-stakes investigations, tense negotiations, and moments where the weight of the world rested squarely on his shoulders, but those days were behind him now. At 67 years old, Harold cherished the tranquility of retirement, finding joy in the little things: a warm cup of tea, the rustling leaves outside, and the satisfaction of watching his roses bloom under his care. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the lingering restlessness that sometimes crept up on him after years of living in constant motion, or maybe it was just the need to stretch his legs and clear his mind. Whatever the reason, Harold decided to take a short drive around the neighborhood. He put down his book, grabbed his keys from the side table, and slipped into his well-worn leather jacket. As he stepped out onto the porch, the cool breeze greeted him, brushing against his face like an old friend. His car, a modest, dark blue sedan with slightly tinted windows, waited patiently in the driveway. It wasn't anything flashy, just reliable. Transportation that suited Harold's practical nature. He slid behind the wheel, feeling the familiar creak of the seat as he adjusted it. Starting the engine, he let the gentle hum soothe him. There was something comforting about driving at night, especially when the streets were empty and the only sounds came from the tires rolling smoothly over asphalt. As Harold drove, he allowed his thoughts to wander. Memories of his time at the FBI occasionally surfaced, but they no longer carried the sharp edges they once did. Instead, they felt distant, almost like scenes from someone else's life. He thought about the agents he'd mentored, the cases he'd solved, and the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Yet, despite all the accolades and accomplishments, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more to learn about people, their fears, their hopes, their capacity for both good and bad. Unbeknownst to Harold, 2 rookie police officers were patrolling the same area not far away. Officer Daniels and Officer Carter had only been on the force for a few months, eager to prove themselves but still green enough to make mistakes. They were responding to a vague dispatch call about a suspicious vehicle reported in the vicinity. A.E., dark blue sedan with tinted windows, matching Harold's car almost perfectly. The description alone wouldn't have raised any alarms if it weren't for recent concerns about rising crime rates in the area. Every officer was on edge, hyper-aware of potential threats lurking in plain sight. Daniels, the younger of the two, gripped the steering wheel tightly as they scanned the streets. His partner, Carter, fidgeted in the passenger seat, adjusting his radio and glancing nervously at every passing car. Neither of them noticed Harold's sedan until it turned onto a quieter street ahead of them. Something about the way the vehicle moved caught Daniel's attention. Not erratic, but deliberate, as though the driver was focused on something specific. Without hesitation, he flicked on the patrol car's flashing lights and accelerated to catch up. For Harold, the sudden appearance of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror came as a complete surprise. He slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder, puzzled, but compliant. What could this be about? Had he accidentally run a stop sign or forgotten to signal a turn? Nothing came to mind, but Harold knew better than to question authority. He rolled down his window, resting his hands loosely on the steering wheel as he waited for the officer to approach. Moments later, a figure appeared in his peripheral vision. It was Daniels, flashlight in hand, peering cautiously into the car. Harold glanced at him, noting the young man's tense posture and the slight tremor in his voice as he asked for license and registration. Despite the situation, Harold remained calm. offering a polite smile as he reached for his wallet and documents. "Evening, officer," Harold said warmly, hoping to ease the tension. "Is everything all right?" Daniels hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. He glanced back at his partner who had exited the patrol car and was now standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. Carter's presence seemed to embolden Daniels, who straightened his stance and repeated his request more firmly. Harold complied without argument, explaining that he was simply out for a leisurely drive to unwind after dinner. But as the seconds ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier. Carter stepped closer, his demeanor far less cordial than Daniels. His eyes darted between Harold and the interior of the car, searching for something, anything, that might justify their suspicion. When Harold leaned forward slightly to retrieve his insurance papers from the glove compartment, Carter's hand instinctively went to his holster. "What are you doing?" Carter barked, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Harold froze, raising his hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "I'm getting my insurance information," Harold replied evenly, careful to keep his tone measured. "It's right here." But Carter wasn't listening. His finger hovered near the trigger of his weapon, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Daniels, too, had drawn his gun, though his aim wavered uncertainly. For Harold, the realization hit hard. These young officers saw him not as a harmless elderly man enjoying a quiet drive, but as a potential threat. And in that moment, all the lessons he'd learned about staying calm under pressure came rushing back. Despite the chaos unfolding around him, Harold focused on one thing: surviving this encounter. The night air was thick with tension as Harold Grayson sat motionless in his sedan, the beam of a flashlight piercing through the darkness and landing squarely on his face. The young officer standing outside his window, Officer Daniels, looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His voice wavered slightly as he repeated his demand for Harold's license and registration. Harold could see the nervousness in the officer's eyes, the way his hand trembled ever so slightly while holding the flashlight. It wasn't hostility that radiated from him, but uncertainty, an almost palpable fear of what might happen next. Harold did his best to project calmness. He spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing each word with care. "Evening, officer," he said, his tone warm and steady. "I'm happy to provide my documents. Everything is in order." As he reached into his pocket for his wallet, he noticed how Daniel's body stiffened. The officer took a small step back, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Harold paused, sensing the unease around him. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, signaling that he meant no harm. "Just getting my ID," he added gently, hoping to reassure the young man. But before Harold could retrieve his wallet, another figure emerged from the patrol car parked behind them. Officer Carter, taller and broader than his partner, approached, with a brisk, purposeful stride. Unlike Daniels, who seemed hesitant and unsure, Carter exuded an air of authority, or perhaps it was aggression. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared, and his hand hovered dangerously close to the holster at his side. When he reached Harold's window, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "What are you doing out here?" Carter snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. Harold blinked, taken aback by the sudden change in tone. He glanced between the two officers, trying to gauge their intentions. "I live nearby," Harold replied calmly, keeping his voice even. "I was just out for a drive to clear my head after dinner. Nothing unusual." Carter frowned, clearly unconvinced. His gaze darted toward the interior of Harold's car, scanning for anything suspicious. The dark tint of the windows didn't help matters. It created shadows where none existed, feeding into the growing suspicion. Harold felt a knot forming in his stomach. Something about this exchange felt off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "License and registration," Carter barked again, louder this time. His impatience was evident, and Harold knew better than to argue or hesitate further. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward to open the glove compartment. Inside were his insurance papers, neatly organized alongside a few spare pens and receipts. But as Harold moved, Carter reacted instantly. "Stop right there," Carter shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Harold froze, mid-motion, his fingers hovering over the glove compartment latch. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Daniels take a step closer, his own weapon now drawn. The metallic glint of the gun caught the dim streetlight, sending a chill down Harold's spine. "I'm just reaching for my papers," Harold said, his voice firmer now, tinged with urgency. "There's nothing to worry about." But Carter wasn't listening. His focus was razor-sharp, zeroed in on Harold's movements. To him, every action, even something as mundane as opening a glove compartment, was potentially dangerous. Harold realized then that these officers weren't seeing him as a retired FBI director or a harmless elderly man. They saw only a silhouette in a car, a potential threat lurking in the shadows. Daniels, meanwhile, looked torn. He glanced nervously at his partner, then back at Harold. There was conflict in his expression, a mix of duty and doubt. He hadn't been on the force long enough to develop the instincts that came with experience, and the weight of the situation was clearly overwhelming him. Still, he kept his gun trained on Harold, mimicking Carter's stance even if his aim wasn't as steady. Harold's mind raced. Decades of training and leadership had taught him how to handle high-pressure situations. But this was different. This wasn't a negotiation room or a crime scene. It was a quiet suburban street, and he was the subject of unwarranted suspicion. He knew better than to make any sudden moves or raise his voice. Instead, he focused on breathing deeply, maintaining eye contact with Daniels whenever possible. If anyone was going to de-escalate the situation, it would have to be him. "Officers," Harold began, his tone measured but firm. "I understand you're doing your job, and I respect that. But I assure you there's no reason to be alarmed. I'm unarmed and I've done nothing wrong. Let me show you my documents so we can resolve this quickly." His words hung in the air, unanswered. Carter remained silent, his expression unreadable. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, glancing once more at his partner for guidance. For a moment it seemed like Harold's plea might break through the tension. Then, without warning, Carter raised his voice again. "Get out of the car," he commanded, stepping closer to the driver's side door. Harold felt a surge of adrenaline, but he forced himself to stay composed. He nodded slowly, raising his hands higher to show compliance. "All right," Harold said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I'll step out. Just let me do it slowly." He unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the car door open, moving deliberately to avoid alarming the officers. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated. As he stood up, the cool night air hit him, sending a shiver down his spine. He turned to face the officers, his hands still raised, palms outward. "See? No weapons," Harold said, gesturing slightly to indicate his empty hands. "I'm just a man taking a drive. That's all." For a brief moment, it seemed like the situation might ease. Daniels lowered his weapon slightly, his shoulders relaxing as he processed Harold's words. But Carter remained rigid, his gun still pointed directly at Harold. His eyes narrowed, scrutinizing every detail, the way Harold held himself, the faint creases in his jacket, the calmness in his demeanor. Something clicked in Carter's mind. This wasn't just some random civilian. It was someone who knew exactly how to handle himself under pressure, someone who radiated authority even in the most chaotic moments, and that realization only made Carter more suspicious. "Who are you?" Carter demanded, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Why are you really out here?" Harold hesitated, weighing his options. Should he reveal his identity now? Or wait until backup arrived? Either choice carried risks, but staying silent wouldn't help diffuse the escalating tension. Taking a deep breath, Harold decided to speak. "My name is Harold Grayson," he said, enunciating each syllable clearly. "I'm a retired FBI director. I've spent my entire career serving this country and working with law enforcement agencies like yours. I promise you, I'm not a threat." The effect of his words was immediate. Daniel's eyes widened in shock and his gun dropped slightly. Even Carter faltered for a split second, his grip loosening on his weapon. But just as quickly, Carter's skepticism returned. Prove it, he growled, refusing to lower his guard. Show me some ID. Harold nodded, understanding the request. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license, holding it up for the officers to see. Daniels leaned in to examine it, his posture softening further. Carter, however, remained unmoved, his weapon still trained on Harold. Backup arrived moments later, the flashing lights of additional patrol cars illuminating the scene. Among them was Sergeant Michelle Reyes, a seasoned officer known for her ability to remain calm under pressure. She took one look at the situation and immediately stepped in, her commanding presence diffusing much of the tension. "What's going on here?" she asked sharply, her gaze sweeping between the officers and Harold. Daniels stammered an explanation, while Carter stubbornly defended his actions. Harold, meanwhile, stood quietly, waiting for the storm to pass. Sergeant Reyes listened, intently, her expression hardening as she pieced together what had happened. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but controlled. "This man is Harold Grayson," she said, addressing both officers. "He's a decorated former FBI director. You should know better than to escalate a routine traffic stop like this." Her words struck a nerve. Daniels looked visibly ashamed while Carter bristled but said nothing. The situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and now the consequences would begin to unfold. Sergeant Michelle Reyes stepped into the scene like a storm settling over troubled waters. Her presence was commanding yet calm, her years of experience evident in the way she carried herself. She moved with purpose, her boots clicking against the asphalt as she approached Harold Grayson and the two officers. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off her uniform, casting sharp shadows across her face. Her eyes scanned the situation quickly. Harold standing with his hands raised, Carter's gun still pointed at him, and Daniels looking increasingly uneasy. "What's going on here?" Reyes asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. There was no room for hesitation or excuses in her tone. She wanted answers, and she wanted them now. Daniels was the first to respond, stammering nervously as he tried to explain. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching this description," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Harold's sedan. "We pulled him over to check it out, but when he reached into the glove compartment..." His voice trailed off, unsure how to finish without sounding defensive. Reyes turned her attention to Carter, who stood rigidly by the driver's side door, his weapon still trained on Harold. "And you?" she asked sharply. "Why is your gun still drawn?" Carter hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced at Harold, then back at Reyes, his pride warring with his instincts. Finally, he muttered. He didn't comply immediately. We had to assume the worst. Reyes's expression darkened. She took a step closer to Carter, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "Assume the worst? Do you know who this man is? This isn't some random suspect. It's Harold Grayson, a former FBI director. You don't point a gun at someone like that unless you're absolutely certain they pose an immediate threat. And from where I'm standing, there's no threat. Here." Her words hit Carter like a punch to the gut. For the first time since the stop began, he lowered his weapon, though reluctantly. The weight of what he'd done, and what he might have caused, was beginning to sink in. But Reyes wasn't finished. She turned to Harold, her demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Grayson, I apologize for this misunderstanding," she said respectfully. "Are you all right?" Harold nodded, his hands finally dropping to his sides. Despite everything, he managed a small, weary smile. "I'm fine, Sergeant. Just surprised, to say the least." Reyes nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before turning back to her subordinates. She could see the cracks forming in their composure. Daniels looked visibly shaken, while Carter struggled to maintain his tough exterior. It was clear that neither of them had intended for things to escalate this far, but good intentions weren't enough to undo the damage already done. "Holster your weapons," Reyes ordered firmly. Both officers obeyed without argument, though Carter did so with obvious reluctance. Once the immediate danger had passed, Reyes motioned for Harold to step aside. She needed to get a clearer picture of what had happened, starting with his perspective. "Can you tell me what led up to this?" she asked. keeping her tone neutral. Harold recounted the events calmly, explaining how he'd been pulled over for no apparent reason, and how the situation had escalated when he reached for his documents. He didn't raise his voice or accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He simply stated the facts as they happened. Reyes listened intently, nodding occasionally to show she understood. When Harold finished, Reyes turned back to Daniels and Carter. "Is that consistent with your account?" she asked. Daniels nodded eagerly, eager to distance himself from blame. "Yes, ma'am. That's pretty much what happened. We thought he might be hiding something." "And you?" Reyes pressed, fixing her gaze on Carter. Carter shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I acted based on protocol," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can't take chances in situations like this." Reyes crossed her arms, unimpressed. "Protocol doesn't mean jumping straight to lethal force," she countered. "It means assessing the situation, using judgment, and de-escalating when possible. Did either of you ask Mr. Grayson why he was reaching into the glove compartment before drawing your weapons?" Both officers fell silent, unable to answer. Reyes let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting it sink in just how far they'd strayed from proper procedure. Then she turned her attention back to Harold. "Would you be willing to file a formal complaint?" she asked gently. "This kind of behavior cannot go unchecked." Harold considered the question carefully. He knew the power of accountability. After all, he'd spent decades advocating for justice and integrity within law enforcement. But he also understood the complexities of policing, especially for rookies like Daniels and Carter. Filing a complaint would likely ruin their careers, and while they had made serious mistakes, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for them. "No," Harold said finally, shaking his head. "I won't press charges, but I do think there's an opportunity here to learn, to grow, and to prevent something like this from happening again." Reyes nodded, respecting his decision. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Your willingness to forgive speaks volumes about your character. Rest assured, we'll handle this internally." With that, she dismissed the two officers, instructing them to return to the station for further questioning. As they walked away, Daniels looked visibly relieved, while Carter wore an expression of simmering resentment. Reyes watched them go, her mind already working through the steps needed to address the incident properly. Once the officers were gone, Reyes turned back to Harold. "Let us give you a ride home," she offered. "After everything that's happened, you shouldn't have to drive yourself." Harold hesitated for a moment, then accepted the offer. He climbed into the front seat of Reyes's patrol car, grateful for the chance to sit quietly and process everything that had transpired. The adrenaline rush from earlier had faded, leaving behind a deep weariness that settled into his bones. As they drove, Reyes broke the silence. "You handled yourself remarkably well back there," she said, glancing at him briefly before focusing on the road. "Not many people could stay that composed under such pressure." Harold chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "Years of practice, I suppose. When you've faced down criminals and terrorists, a traffic stop, even one gone wrong, feels almost manageable by comparison." Reyes smiled faintly, appreciating his attempt to lighten the mood. "Still, it takes strength to remain calm when fear is telling you to react otherwise. Not everyone has that kind of self-control." They arrived at Harold's house shortly afterward. Reyes parked outside and walked him to the door, ensuring he was safe before leaving. Before she departed, she handed him her card. "If you change your mind about filing a complaint or if anything else comes up, don't hesitate to reach out. You deserve justice, Mr. Grayson." Harold thanked her sincerely, watching as she returned to her patrol car and drove away. Standing on his porch, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: frustration, exhaustion, and even a strange sense of hope. What had started as a peaceful evening had turned into a life-altering encounter, one that exposed flaws in the system he'd once been a part of. Yet, despite the chaos, he saw an opportunity for growth, not just for himself but for others as well. Inside the house, Harold poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the room, grounding him in the present moment. He thought about the young officers, their fear, their mistakes, and the lessons they would hopefully take away from this night. He thought about Sergeant Reyes, whose professionalism and fairness had restored some measure of trust in the situation. And he thought about himself, realizing that even after years of service, he still had much to learn about patience, empathy, and resilience. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking the passage of time. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful, blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded mere blocks away. For Harold, however, the world felt different now, a little darker perhaps, but also tinged with possibility. He resolved to use this experience as a catalyst for change, both within himself and in the broader community. After all, true leadership wasn't about wielding power. It was about inspiring others to do better, to be better. And with that thought, Harold rose from the table, switched off the light, and headed upstairs to bed. The night may have been long, but tomorrow promised new beginnings, and Harold intended to make the most of them. The morning after the incident, Harold Grayson woke up to a world that felt subtly different. The sun streamed through his bedroom window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor, but the serenity of the scene was interrupted by the weight of what had transpired the night before. As he brewed himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet evening drive had set off a chain reaction far beyond anything he could have anticipated. By mid-morning, the story had exploded into public consciousness. News outlets picked up on the dramatic details. Retired FBI director held at gunpoint during routine traffic stop. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage. Hashtags like "Justice for Grayson" trending nationwide. People were shocked, not just because of who Harold was, but because of the broader implications of the incident. It wasn't merely about one man being wrongfully detained. It was about trust, accountability, and the fragile relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. Harold tried to ignore the noise, retreating to his garden to tend to his roses. He pruned the overgrown stems and watered the soil, finding solace in the simplicity of the task. Yet even here, the outside world intruded. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, concerned friends, and former colleagues. Some praised him for handling the situation with grace, while others urged him to take legal action against the officers involved. Each message carried its own emotional weight, but Harold remained resolute in his decision not to press charges. That afternoon, however, the full scope of the fallout became clear. Body cam footage from Officers Daniels and Carter was released to the public, revealing inconsistencies in their accounts of the stop. In the video, Harold appeared calm and cooperative throughout, offering explanations and complying with every request. Meanwhile, the officer's behavior looked increasingly erratic. Carter's aggressive tone stood out starkly, as did Daniels's visible hesitation and confusion. The contrast painted a damning picture of poor judgment and lack of proper training. Public opinion turned sharply against the officers. Local news anchors dissected the footage frame by frame, highlighting moments where protocol seemed to have been ignored. Community leaders spoke out, condemning the reckless use of force and calling for systemic reforms within the police department. Even some members of law enforcement voiced concerns, acknowledging that incidents like this eroded public trust and undermined the hard work of dedicated officers everywhere. Sergeant Michelle Reyes played a pivotal role in addressing the growing controversy. At a hastily organized press conference, she reiterated her commitment to accountability and transparency. Standing behind a podium adorned with the department's emblem, she addressed the crowd with unwavering composure. "What happened last night should never have occurred," she began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "Mr. Grayson is a respected figure who has devoted his life to serving justice. To treat him, or anyone, with such disregard for due process is unacceptable." Reyes went on to outline the steps the department would take to address the incident. Both officers Daniels and Carter were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Additionally, the department announced plans to review its training protocols, particularly those related to de-escalation techniques and racial bias. While Reyes stopped short of assigning blame publicly, her tone made it clear that serious consequences awaited those responsible. As the investigation unfolded, cracks began to show in the partnership between Daniels and Carter. During interviews with internal affairs investigators, Daniels admitted that he had felt uneasy about drawing his weapon so quickly. "I didn't want to escalate things," he confessed, his voice trembling. "But Officer Carter insisted we needed to be cautious. I trusted his judgment, and now I realize I shouldn't have." Carter, on the other hand, remained defiant. When questioned about his actions, he doubled down on his earlier defense, claiming that he had acted in accordance with protocol. "You can't second-guess yourself in the field," he argued. "If you hesitate, people get hurt. I wasn't going to let that happen." Despite his insistence, evidence mounted against him. Internal affairs officials discovered discrepancies in his report, including fabricated details meant to justify his aggressive behavior. Worse still, witnesses came forward corroborating Harold's version of events, further undermining Carter's credibility. By the end of the week, the department had no choice but to act decisively. Carter was arrested and charged with misconduct and reckless endangerment, while Daniels faced lesser disciplinary measures, including mandatory retraining and a suspension, without pay. The news of Carter's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. For many, it was a long overdue reckoning, a sign that the system could hold even its own accountable when necessary. But for Harold, the outcome brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of vindication, knowing that justice had been served in some form. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel sorrow for the young officer, whose career had unraveled so spectacularly. Carter's arrogance and refusal to admit fault had sealed his fate, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ego and fear. In the weeks that followed, Harold emerged as an unexpected advocate for reform. Though he had initially chosen not to file a complaint, he recognized the unique platform the incident had given him. Invitations poured in from civic organizations, universities, and advocacy groups eager to hear his perspective on policing and accountability. Harold accepted several of these offers, using each appearance to amplify his message of understanding and change. At a town hall meeting hosted by a local nonprofit, Harold addressed a packed auditorium with characteristic poise. "We live in challenging times," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "Fear and mistrust have taken root in our society, often pitting neighbor against neighbor and civilian against officer, but we cannot allow these divisions to define us. Instead, we must seek common ground." He went on to share his personal experience, describing the traffic stop in detail and emphasizing the importance of empathy in high-stakes situations. When you're holding a badge or a gun, it's easy to see the world in black and white, to view everyone as either ally or adversary. But real life exists in shades of gray. Every person you encounter has a story, a history, and a humanity worth respecting. His words struck a chord with the audience, earning applause and nods of agreement. Afterward, attendees lined up to speak with him, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement, some positive, others deeply troubling. Harold listened intently to each one, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. It was clear that his presence had sparked meaningful conversations, bridging gaps that had long seemed insurmountable. Meanwhile, the police department worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the community. Sergeant Reyes spearheaded new initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue between officers and residents. Monthly forums were established, providing a safe space for open discussions about policing practices and community concerns. Officers participated in workshops focused on cultural competency and conflict resolution, learning how to approach situations with greater sensitivity and care. Though progress was slow, signs of improvement began to emerge. Residents reported feeling more comfortable interacting with officers, while officers expressed renewed pride in their roles as protectors and peacemakers. It was a delicate balance, requiring constant effort and vigilance, but the seeds of change had been planted. For Harold, The entire ordeal served as a reminder of the complexities inherent in human interactions. Despite his decades of experience, he realized there was always more to learn about patience, humility, and the power of forgiveness. Rather than dwell on bitterness or resentment, he chose to focus on the opportunities ahead. Whether mentoring young leaders, speaking at events, or simply tending to his garden, Harold approached each day with renewed purpose. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Harold reflected on the journey that had unfolded since that fateful night. The scars of the experience would linger, invisible yet undeniable. But so too would the lessons learned, the realization that even in moments of darkness, there is potential for light. And with that thought, Harold smiled, faintly, savoring the quiet beauty of the moment. Months had passed since the night that changed Harold Grayson's life, and though the initial shockwaves of the incident had settled, its ripple effects continued to shape both his world and the community around him. The traffic stop that began as a routine encounter had become a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about accountability, trust, and reform, not just in Arlington but across the nation. For Harold, it was a reminder that even in retirement he still had a role to play in shaping the future. The trial of Officer Carter drew significant attention, with media outlets covering every detail of the proceedings. In court, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Carter's misconduct, including body cam footage, witness testimonies, and internal affairs reports. His attempts to justify his actions fell flat under cross-examination, leaving jurors visibly unimpressed. When the verdict came down, guilty on charges of reckless endangerment and misconduct, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Outside, supporters of police reform cheered quietly, while others expressed disappointment over the tarnishing of yet another badge. Officer Daniels, meanwhile, faced a different path. Though spared criminal charges, his career hung precariously in the balance. Suspended without pay and required to undergo extensive retraining, he found himself grappling with guilt and self-doubt. During one particularly candid session with a counselor assigned by the department, Daniels admitted that the incident haunted him. "I keep replaying it in my mind," he confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "What if I'd stepped in sooner? What if I'd trusted my instincts instead of following Carter?" His counselor encouraged him to view the experience as an opportunity for growth rather than failure. "You're not defined by your mistakes," she told him gently. "It's what you do next that matters." Inspired by this advice, Daniels threw himself into his training, determined to emerge stronger and more capable. He began volunteering at youth outreach programs, speaking openly about the importance of responsibility and accountability. Slowly, but surely he started rebuilding trust, with himself and with the community he served. As for Sergeant Michelle Reyes, her leadership during the crisis earned widespread praise. Promoted to captain shortly after the incident, she became a champion for systemic reforms within the department. Under her guidance, new policies were implemented to ensure greater transparency and accountability. Officers were now required to undergo regular de-escalation training, and independent oversight committees were established to review critical incidents. Reyes also introduced initiatives aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement and marginalized communities, recognizing that true safety could only be achieved through mutual respect. Harold watched these developments unfold with cautious optimism. While he knew that meaningful change took time, he couldn't help but feel proud of the progress being made. At the same time, he remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. Reform wasn't just about rewriting rules or introducing new programs. It was about changing hearts and minds. And that, he understood, was a far more difficult task. One crisp autumn morning, Harold received an invitation to speak at a national conference on policing and public trust. The event brought together law enforcement leaders, policymakers, and activists from across the country, all united by a shared desire to create safer, fairer communities. Standing on stage before a packed auditorium, Harold felt a familiar mix of nerves and determination. This was his chance to share not just his story but also the lessons he'd learned along the way. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and warm. "When I agreed to come here today, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to say. There are no easy answers to the questions we face as a society. But there is one thing I know for certain. Trust isn't something you can demand. It's something you have to earn." He went on to recount the events of that fateful night, describing how fear and misunderstanding had nearly led to tragedy. "In those moments when guns were drawn and tempers flared, I saw firsthand how quickly things can spiral out of control," he said. "But I also saw glimpses of hope, in the professionalism of Sergeant Reyes, in the willingness of Daniels to reflect on his actions, and even in the courage of Carter to admit his mistakes, however belatedly." Harold paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "We live in a world where fear often drives our decisions. Fear of the unknown, fear of danger, fear of making the wrong choice. But if we let fear dictate our actions, we risk losing sight of what truly matters: humanity. Every person we meet, whether they're wearing a uniform or standing on the other side of a car window, is someone's child, parent, friend, or neighbor. They deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter the circumstances." His speech resonated deeply with the audience, earning a standing ovation that rippled through the hall. Afterward, attendees approached him eagerly, eager to shake his hand or thank him for his insights. Many confided in him, sharing their own struggles and triumphs in navigating the complexities of modern policing. Harold listened intently to each story, offering words of encouragement and wisdom whenever possible. Back home, Harold resumed his quieter routines, finding comfort in the familiarity of his daily life. Yet, he couldn't escape the lingering shadow of that night. Whenever he drove past the spot where he'd been pulled over, memories flooded back: the flashing lights, the raised weapons, the suffocating tension. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how easily trust could shatter, and how much effort it took to rebuild it. Still, Harold refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he channeled his energy into mentoring young leaders, many of whom sought his guidance after hearing about his advocacy work. Whether it was advising aspiring FBI agents or counseling local teenagers interested in careers in law enforcement, Harold poured his heart into helping others navigate the moral and ethical dilemmas they might face. "Leadership isn't about power," he often reminded them. "It's about service, about doing what's right even when it's hard." As winter approached, Harold noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Conversations between residents and officers seemed less guarded, more open. Community events drew larger crowds, with families gathering to celebrate holidays and milestones together. Even small gestures, a smile exchanged at the grocery store, a wave from a passing patrol car, felt like signs of healing. One evening, as snowflakes began to fall softly outside, Harold sat by the fire with a cup of hot chocolate, reflecting on the journey he'd traveled. The scars of the past would always remain, invisible yet undeniable. But so too would the lessons learned, the realization that fear could either divide or unite, depending on how it was handled. That forgiveness wasn't weakness but strength, and that every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the power to mend broken bonds. In the end, Harold knew that perfection was impossible. Mistakes would continue to happen, tensions would flare, and trust would need constant nurturing. But he also believed in the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to grow, adapt, and strive for something better. As he gazed out the window at the snow-covered streets, he allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. Life had tested him, challenged him, and ultimately strengthened him. And for that, he was thankful. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel, marking the passage of time. Outside, the world moved forward, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. For Harold Grayson, the road ahead was uncertain, but filled with hope.